Okay, welcome everyone back to another lecture on the H1 Csq1. For this lecture, we'll be going through the 2018 paper 1, question 1 on the global fishing industry. I'll be going through the higher order thinking questions. So now this is about our third lecture, so I'll start dissecting a little bit faster, and y'all try to keep up and maybe understand the processes that comes behind this dissection. Okay, so we'll be focusing on question D, E part 2, and F. So for E, right, because we have no more 7 marks, I'll change it to a 6-mark question. Just discuss whether the services of SFPA are likely to possess the two main qualities of a public good. Okay, so before I even read the extracts, right, when I dissect this question, when I see two main characteristics of a public good, I know I need to look out for non-rivalry and non-excludability. And because it's a discuss question, I need to make a value judgment on whether or not it is likely to be a public good or not, or likely possess the characteristics of a public good. Okay, for E part 2, right, explain and comment on the likely economic effects for the market for fish caught when subsidies are significantly reduced. Okay, so when I see subsidies are significantly reduced, right, the first thing I think of is the MCOP will likely increase, and this will likely lead to a fall in supply. And when I see economic effects, right, don't think about the macroeconomy yet. Look at the question first. They say market for fish, right? So I'm thinking that this is a DDSS question, and I know that if it's a DDSS question, I want to focus on the market. I'll probably focus on P and Q, price and quantity, most importantly. Okay. Lastly, for part F, it seems difficult to enforce regulation to tackle the negative environmental externalities that arise from overfishing. Discuss the view that taxation is the best approach to tackle such a market failure like this. So here I know straight away it's a policy question, and I'll probably have to write two policies, right? My policy 1, policy 2, and evaluation. So the given policy is taxation, and the market failure given is negative externality. But here we need to be clear that this is actually quite a similar question to a previous one. So because I never explained negative externality at all in any of my parts, right, you realize that I'll most probably have to explain the externality somewhere. So I'll have to explain the externality plus the policies. Okay, and here, even though by right we always tell y'all that externalities should be human, right? Should be human related. You see, they don't give you much room here, as they told you specifically negative environmental externalities. And so likely, if Cambridge forces us to take an environmental route, we would probably have to discuss it in terms of the environment, but we will try to see the extracts if they can link anything to humans. Okay, so now we'll go through the extracts for this question. So straight off the bat, for my extract 1, I see that this is just about the how pervasive illegal fishing is, especially in Africa. But then you realize that this illegal fishing, even though it may seem a bit relevant, for our high order thinking questions, we're focusing a lot on China, so maybe not so relevant, right? And here I'm talking about the Irish whelk industry and the economy. I see something very interesting here. I see the SFPA. So I want to see if there's anything that gives me a clue on whether or not SFPA is a public good or not. So here, the point of the SFPA is to promote compliance with the laws set out by the SFPA to help to deter and detect these people who flout the laws, right? So people who flout the sea fishery safety law, blah blah blah. So it acts as a police service and to catch the certain minority who avoid legislation and take unfair commercial advantage over their fellow fishermen. So actually, we realize here they don't actually explicitly say much about the characteristics of the SFPA itself. So there has to be some inference that comes from our part. For extract 3, when you talk about why fish are going up in price, right, you realize straight away I see one thing. Demand has certainly been rising in Europe and increasingly in China. So that's nice because they talk about China, reflecting the growing living standards in the country, the rising popularity of the species, right, on grounds of health benefits. So there's been a rising popularity. So this is straight away we know is a demand factor, right? It's a favorable change in taste and preference. Okay, and then here they say supply influencers should not be disregarded. There's been an increase. There's been a fall in supply because they are better able to reduce the amount of illegal fishing. So even though supply falls, price increases, right? It's actually a good thing because the supply is falling because they are reducing the incidence of illegal fishing, right? So then I continue. So this basically to just talk about illegal fishing. When I look at extract for world fish output, right? The most important thing I want to draw my eyes on is the figure itself. Why? What does the figure tell me? It shows me, right, that over time, you realize that the amount of farm fish used for food is actually steadily increasing to the point where it is projected by 2025 that it will actually exceed the total number of fish caught in the wild for both food and non-food users. Okay, by 2015 it already exceeded the amount of fish caught for food users, but in 2025 it exceeds both the fish caught in the wild for non-food and food users. So this is something very interesting we need to take note of. So let's delve straight into question D, right? So for question D, give me a second. For part D of this CSQ, right, identify and explain whether or not they are likely to have the two main characteristics of a public good. So here, before I even start writing my question, right, I know straight away that because they're testing me on an econs concept, as best as possible, I should give my definitions. So I need to explain what a public good is, explain it in context to the SFPA, and then evaluate whether or not it is a public good. It sounds very long, but it's actually very short. So public good, right, non-rivalrous. When it's non-rivalrous, the key idea I want to bring about is that one's consumption of it does not diminish another person's ability to consume. Another person's ability to consume. What this means is that you can see that the marginal cost for producing for another consumer is actually zero because it doesn't cost the firm any additional cost if they want to provide the good for someone else because the availability is not diminished, right? When I talk about non-excludability, the focus here is that it is costly or even impossible to exclude non-payers from consuming the good. What this means is that once I choose to provide the good, right, it is actually difficult, if not impossible, for me to actually stop someone who has not been able to, refuses to pay, who has not been able. So this leads to a free rider problem, right, where people are unwilling to pay but they still get the benefits of the good. So when I link it to the SFPA, right, you realize that because they govern the seas and the fishing area, so long they fall under the jurisdiction. So long they fall under the jurisdiction of the SFPA, they fall under jurisdiction. They'll get protected. So they get the benefits of the SFPA, right? And that means that so long they're in the jurisdiction, if maybe the SFPA doesn't require them to pay, they won't need to pay. So hence, we can conclude that this is non-excludable, right? Because the fishermen, so long they're fishing in that area, they're actually already protected. The other one, right, is that you see they cover the whole area. So if I protect one fisherman compared to multiple fishermen coming in, right, you realize that the marginal cost for me protecting that one more fisherman actually doesn't increase my cost. The marginal cost is zero. So additional fishermen working under the jurisdiction enjoy same levels of protection, right? Because I'm just protecting the area, I'm protecting the fishermen in the area, but by and large, or strictly speaking, I'm protecting the area itself. So same levels of protection. So it is non-rivalrous. However, we realize, right, that if they choose to charge people who want to fish in that area, right, if they choose to charge for their protection, protection, it can be excludable. Similarly, right, if there are too many fishermen, they have to expand their area of jurisdiction, right? And to expand their area, or maybe not just expand their area, if they need to hire more workers, more people to surveil the area, you realize that so that I can keep up with all the fishermen there, right? You realize that there's actually an incurred cost. So the marginal cost is not zero. So it is actually rivalrous. It becomes rivalrous in nature. So why do I have to present both sides, right? Because at its core, this is a comment question. You have to provide a two-sided, a balanced argument to this question, right? So even though these are very possible likelihoods, at the end we need to have a very short conclusion that SFPA likely possesses characteristics of a public good. And you need to just give a short reason why, right? Characteristics of a public good. For the very simple reason that they are maybe they are a government organization, so they're not profit maximizing government organization. They're not profit maximizing, they probably won't charge people for it. And the marginal cost is likely not to improve because the area of jurisdiction, right? Let's say if it gets too big, maybe they'll put in one more, they'll put in two more, but realistically speaking, right, for most of them, marginal cost for producing for another person is basically close to zero. So here we have it done, the 6-mark question. We explain what public good is, contextualize it to SFPA, make a value judgment on whether or not they likely possess the characteristics of a public good. So that's the 6-mark question. I'll give you about 2 seconds to screenshot this and I'll move on to part 2. Okay? Part 2, explain and comment on the economic effects for the market of fish when subsidies are significantly reduced. So here, right, our key argument 1 and key argument 2 may not be as strictly split up, but if I had to split them up, I'll split my key argument 1 into a fall in supply and my key argument 2 talking about PED. Why? Because you realize that directly speaking, right, when subsidies are reduced, straight away my supply falls, right? And then I would link it to the economic effects in the market. But to what extent does it fall largely depends on the elasticity or the price elasticity of demand, right? So this one tells me the extent of economic effects. So very clearly these are 2 key arguments. So when I talk about my key argument 1, right, I will draw my diagram. So my key argument 1 for fall in supply, when I write I won't write fall in supply, I'll just say that the fall in subsidies will lead to an increase in marginal cost of production. So definitely have to draw a graph. I won't label the graph in the interest of time. I'll just draw how the graph should look like. So there's a S0, S1, D0, and you can see that there's a Q0, Q1, there's a rise in price and a fall in quantity, right? So here, here for the market for fish, right, you have to write the market for fish, right? You have to be very precise. You have to realize that initially at this initial price there's a, oh my goodness, there's a shortage, right? At initial price P0 when S1. So here increase in MCOP, I would say fall in supply from S0 to S1. And then after this, how would I explain the economic effects? I will explain my price mechanism. So by now we should be very familiar with the price mech. And after the price mech, so initially there's a shortage, and then after that consumers will bid up prices. As prices increase, QD falls, QS increases until they reach new equilibrium where QD equals to QS again at P1 where S1 intersects D0, and this will lead to an increase in price and a fall in quantity, equilibrium quantity, right? So after I explain, so a bulk of my economic analysis comes there, right? And after I explain this, the idea is I always have to link it back to the new equilibrium quantity and price. Correct? Because that is the main question. So that's done with my key argument 1. You can see that actually there's a lot of content marks to be read over here, especially in this price mechanism section, where so long you use the graph. Okay? And then for my key argument 2, I would discuss the effect on PED. How PED can affect. So I would define my PED very quickly, and then I'll say if PED is greater than 1, the total expenditure or the total revenue would, as a result of the price increase, there will be a more than proportionate fall in quantity demanded. The total expenditure, total revenue would fall. If PED is less than 1, the total expenditure or total revenue in the market for fish would increase. Correct? So here, right, I know my endpoint is not total expenditure or total revenue because it's not talking about firms, right? But I use this as a guiding point because this tells me which one shifts by a greater extent, right? Is it the equilibrium price or the equilibrium quantity? Because you see they are moving in opposite direction. Price increases, quantity decreases. So here I have to contextualize it to the fish market, right? I would say that for the market of fish, PED is likely to be very elastic, right? PED is likely to be elastic. Why? Because if we look back at this graph, this figure over here, right, you realize that there's actually a very suitable available alternative, and that is our farm fish. And if the price of, if let's say both consumers perceive the qualities to be similar, right, if the price of the farm fish the wild fish increases by a lot, you realize that actually people will just switch over to the relatively cheaper farmed fish. Am I right? So my PED, right, you need to argue that PED is likely greater than 1, hence the rise in price will lead to a more than proportionate fall in quantity. Okay, the equilibrium quantity. So this answers the question because I'm still talking about the economic effects on the market. Just that here I'm talking about the extent. So this is the 2 different key arguments for our E part 2. And then afterward, I want to look at my evaluative conclusion, right? My synthesis. Evaluative conclusion. So I want to comment on the likely effects. So you need to see, right? Here we said that there's a fall in supply, and then because PED is likely to be elastic, there will be a more than proportionate fall in quantity, equilibrium quantity to the rise in price. Correct? Because the quantity demanded will fall more than proportionally to the rise in price. So here, with my conclusion, right, I can use 2 possible ideas. So here, I would say that if I look at the short run, long run, when I use my ATMS, right, I use my short run versus long run, I would say that in the long run, PED is likely to become, demand is likely to become even more price elastic. Why? Because farm fish becomes an even more available substitute in the long run. More available substitute. And I can quote the figure 1 over here through the projected amount of fish that are going to be sold, that are going to be caught, right? And then if I want to use this short run versus long run, so a 2-mark evaluation, you just need to pick one ATMS angle. Another evaluation that I could choose is I can say that the economic effects on the fish market depends on other factors. So it may not just be due to a change in the subsidies that are provided. So if I look back at my extract, right, just now here we remember there was one that was talking about the why are fish going up in price, and they said that there is a favorable change in taste and preference toward fish recently, and this means that there has been an increase in demand. Correct? So beyond just what we argue about the subsidies, right, you see that in our extract, so we quote extract, there's been a favorable change in taste and preference. So demand actually has been increasing, right? So we can argue that the rise in price may not fully be due to the fall in subsidies. It could also be a result of other economic factors, such as the increase in income and the favorable change in taste and preference towards fish, and hence there will be a large increase in the price. So this is a generally very simple HOT question, right? But when it comes to evaluation, I want to bring you guys through selection of evaluation points. Personally, I would choose this point over this point. Why? Because I'm not saying this point is not accepted, but personally, if I had to make a value judgment exam, I don't have enough time, I would choose that point. Why? Because they want to comment on the likely economic effects for the market for fish when subsidies are significantly reduced. So you see, at the core of it, right, the core idea here is that the subsidies are being reduced. And you see that in my evaluation, as best as possible, I want to tackle the idea of subsidies being reduced, right? So here you see directly, I talk about the subsidies being reduced because when the subsidies are reduced, you realize my PED is relevant. The value of PED is very important if I want to discuss the extent of the economic effects in the market for fish. While it does talk about the economic effects for the market of fish, it does not. So this deals with subsidies. This may not deal with it as precisely or as directly. It may not be directly related to subsidies. Of course, if you have time in an exam, might be even better for you to write both, because you show that you understand that the change in subsidies would lead to a change in the market because of this very important PED factor, but there are alternative factors that could also be affecting the market for fish, which we have not discussed yet. So this is all we have for E part 2. So you just I'll give you about 2 seconds, you can take a snapshot of it. Okay, now I'll go to the last question, right, which is F. F is a bit of a lengthier question, but I won't go through the whole thing in depth because we've done something very similar before. But when I look at F, right, okay, so here they write as a 12-mark question, but we don't have that anymore. So we will just change it to a 10-mark question. So it seems rather demanding for a 10-mark question at first glance, right? So I actually don't think that that's something as that requires as much as this for 10-mark question. But since it is a 12-mark question and we're viewing it as a 10-mark question, we'll just roll with it first, okay? So here, my body paragraph 1, right? I'll talk about the negative environmental externalities. You realize that when I look at my externalities, right, I look through this last extract over here. This last extract is the only one we haven't looked at, right? You see that they actually tell me what? They tell me that the Yangtze River produces less than a quarter of a fish that it did 60 years ago, and most of its fish are on the verge of extinction. And at sea, right, there are irreparable damages done to the coral reefs. Beyond that, right, you realize that they actually gave you a policy. They said that they have attempted to reduce illegal catching by a regulation, but this hasn't been effective, sorry. So generally speaking, they give you one taxation, they give you one regulation policy already, right? So here, I'll just talk about, but they don't give us any externality on humans, correct? So what I would say is, as far as possible, right, I would use the what they gave me. They want me to talk about negative environmental externality, but I will try to infer or come up with a point that can talk about marginal external cost to humans as well. So to be very, very safe, I would engage both the environmental externalities and link it back to the human externalities as best as we can. So very simply, this one we will draw our very typical the market failure diagram, right? So there's an MEC, so this is MSC, this is MPC, and then there's my MPB equals to MSB, and this area will be my deadweight loss. This QS, QP, right? So this is my area of deadweight loss, and then I'll use my PET DQQD framework. So I won't delve into the details of it, but I'll focus on my E and T here. So the E and T, right, for the environmental part, I'll talk about the coral reefs being destroyed, right? The coral reefs being destroyed, or the fish species going extinct. So I'm quoting as much as possible as I can from the extract. Going extinct. And if I want to link it to a human factor, right, you realize that this there's a lot of overfishing, right? That's what they say. There's overfishing, putting extra pressure on fish stocks worldwide, which harms the environment, harms everything, right? But you realize the key argument that I want to talk about here is that when there's overfishing, there's a depletion of fish stock. So this leads to this could result in higher prices or lack of variety for future consumers. So the one everyone to pay close attention here too, right, is that I talk about future consumers. Why? Because when we define externalities, right, and third parties, the third parties have to be parties that are not directly involved in the consumption or the production of the good. If I talk about the consumers today, or if I talk about the fishermen today, right, you realize they cannot exactly be defined as a third party because they are currently involved in the consumption or the production of the good. But if I say that the idea is that when I fish a lot, right, in the future, other people may not be able to enjoy the variety of fish. Other people who are not currently consuming fish may face higher prices for fish. You realize that what I'm saying actually fits the definition of a third party because they are not involved in the production or the consumption of the good now. Okay? So this is my body paragraph 1. And then for the policies, right, very simply, I'll just use my OWL framework. So my body paragraph 2, I will talk about taxes. So I will explain the taxes using my OWL, working of the taxes. I won't go through in detail because by now I think all of us are very familiar with it. The limitations and the evaluation is what I will go through more in depth. Okay, so here, right, if I want to give a limitation, obviously the tax, the easiest limitation is always my imperfect info, right? But if I want to put an in-body evaluation into this, right, how I would do it is I would try to contextualize it, saying that actually levying a tax on producers, right, may actually incentivize more illegal fishing activities. Because the fishermen wouldn't want to pay the taxes, right, it actually decreases the profits that they earn. So if I start taxing them, right, and more and more of them refuse to comply with me, you realize that they would illegally fish more, and this could actually worsen the market failure in the future. Okay, so then moving on to my body paragraph 3, I would talk about rules and regulation. Okay, so I'll bring into an alternative point to it, but why I choose rules and regulation first is because that is what they gave to me. So I'll write my body paragraph 3 will be rules and regulations. I don't think it's a total ban, so I'll use quota. Okay, quota, same thing, we use our OWL analysis. And the hard part about quota with limitation, right, is that it is always it's the same thing, it's the same idea, imperfect info, right? It is difficult to actually establish specifically where my QS is. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing, right, is that when I want to do my in-body evaluation, you need to realize that in the extract 5, they've already told us that regulations have been tried and they failed. Why could they possibly have failed? Maybe because of high admin costs, maybe because of corruption. But the idea behind it, right, is that because the place is so large, right, maybe the sea is endless, basically endless, right, it is very difficult for people to actually fix a quota on the total number of fish that are being fished at sea every day. So this is the kind of evaluation I want to have for regulation, because I am engaging the context that is given to me. Lastly, another possible policy, right, I'll just put alternative BP3, I would talk about subsidizing farm fish. So this one I'll draw the diagram so you all understand. When I subsidize farm fish, right, what happens to the diagram for the fish caught in the wild? QT0. So initially we start off with our negative externality again. And then you see that when I subsidize farm fish MSB, so initially it's here, right? this is QP, and this is QS. When I subsidize farmed fish, you realize what happens is that the MPB, this is for wild fish, okay? The fish caught in the wild. The MPB actually falls. So here I'll just go a little bit more in depth into why it actually falls. Okay? You realize, right, that when I subsidize farmed fish and wild fish, realistically speaking, right, what is the difference? You really can't tell the difference, right? So when I subsidize farm fish, you realize now I subsidize farm fish, the prices for farm fish would fall, right? Actually, the private benefit from me catching their wild fish might actually be relatively lower now as compared to the farm fish, because now farm fish are cheaper to produce or cheaper to farm, right? So because of this, you realize that the marginal private benefit for, so we have to first identify that farmed fish and wild fish are close substitutes, right? After we realize that they are close substitutes, then you say that subsidizing farmed fish, more producers will switch over to farmed fish because it is, the MCOP is lower, it is cheaper to produce, and the relative marginal private benefit, the marginal private benefit of producing wild fish or catching wild fish actually decreases. So MPB falls from MPB to MPB prime, and then after that we continue our OWL analysis and why that will lead to a socially optimal outcome. Okay, so here the limitation is also very simple lah. It's same thing for taxes, same thing for subsidies. You don't know whether or not, so it's always a limitation, is always imperfect info here, right? We don't know how much to subsidize by, and subsidizing, you can also talk about budget, how to financing the subsidies. So generally, between these two arguments, which one will I pick? Personally, if you ask me, if I have the time, I will write both. Why? Because quota is a very short point. There's not much economic analysis, but I would still choose to write quota in my essay, at least some part of it in my essay, because I want to show the Cambridge markers that I'm engaging with the material that they have given me. Because by right, if Cambridge gives us something to use, we have to use it. Okay, so I'm engaging with the policies that are given to me by Cambridge, but I would also write the subsidizing of farmed fish because it is more economically analytical. Okay, moving on to the evaluation, right? So my synthesis, my evaluative conclusion, I just have to make a value judgment on what is the best policy, whether taxation is the best policy, right? So I'll have my synthesis. I would say that tax is a good policy, but it is insufficient alone. Right? Because the issue with overfishing, right, it is not just about people overfishing because they can. It is because it is already difficult to enforce regulation, there's a lot of illegal fishing, and plus the fact that demand is increasing, right? So when I just tax, right, tax doesn't deal with the root problem. If people are illegally fishing, I cannot even be taxing them to begin with. But the tax is good. Why? Because it helps to deal with overfishing from the legal fishermen, from law-abiding fishermen. Right? So actually, to some extent, it will also reduce the market failure there lah. However, I would most likely say that it would be effective if I combine it with something like subsidies. Why? Because when I combine it with subsidies, you realize that the demand for wild fish lowers, and actually when there's a lower demand for wild fish, right, it also tackles the issue of illegal fishing, because when less people want the wild fish, you realize producers will be less likely to go out of their way to go and illegally source for these fish, right? So it reduces the problem of illegal fishing, it reduces the problem of overfishing, and it's actually generally a good idea. right? So I'll combine it with subs. Why will I not do subsidies alone, right? Because subsidies are expensive. So when I say combine with subs, the synthesis that I'm trying to go for here, right, is that I can use the money from the taxes, right, the money I earn from the taxes, and channel it into the subsidies for farm fish. And you realize this is actually a long run strategy to deal with the whole market failure, right? Because at the current point, I deal with overfishing by taxing producers so that they are less incentivized to overfish. In the long run, I use the tax revenue I gain to channel it into subsidies for a more sustainable fishing practice, so that in the long run, people are less incentivized to overfish, less incentivized to illegally fish, and they are more likely to, and overall in the whole market, or in the production of fish, right, in the catching of fish, this whole market, you realize that it's likely going to be more allocatively efficient, or it's likely going to be more socially optimal, or closer to socially optimal outcome in the long run. Okay, so this is generally a bit of a longer question. I'll give you about 3 seconds to take a picture of this, take a snapshot of this. If you have any questions, do seek out your tutors. And that's all for the lecture on 2018 question 1. And I will see all of you in the next lecture for 2018 question 2. Okay, bye bye.